On December 5, 1945, 14 men boarded 5 warplanes in Florida. 2 hours later, they had all disappeared without a trace. But that's not the strangest part of this story. What really sends chills down your spine is that when they sent a rescue plane to look for them, it also vanished into thin air. In total, 27 people disappeared in a single afternoon, and to this day, no one knows exactly what happened. It was a normal afternoon at the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale. Mechanics were checking engines, pilots were studying their maps, and everything seemed routine. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a war veteran with more than 2,500 flight hours, was preparing to lead a training mission that would change aviation history forever. Taylor was not a novice pilot. He had fought in the Pacific during World War II and knew those TBM Avenger aircraft like the back of his hand. That day, 5 of these torpedo bombers lined up on the runway, each with its crew of 3 men. The mission had a simple name that would become legendary: Flight 19. The plan was straightforward. They would fly east for 56 miles to the Hens and Chickens Keys, where they would practice bombing. Then they would turn north for 67 miles to Grand Bahama Island, and finally return home flying southwest for 73 miles. A perfect triangle over the ocean. It should take exactly 2 hours. At 2:10 in the afternoon, the 5 Avengers roared down the runway and rose into the blue Florida sky. The tower controllers watched them fly away until they became tiny dots on the horizon. Everything normal so far. The first radio reports came in as scheduled. The pilots confirmed they had reached their target and completed the bombing practice. But then, at 3:45 in the afternoon, something began to go terribly wrong. Taylor's voice crackled over the radio with a blood-chilling message: "Control towers, this is an emergency. We appear to be lost. We cannot see land. Repeat, we cannot see land." The flight controller immediately responded, trying to stay calm. He asked Taylor to report his position, but the answer he received made no sense. Taylor insisted that his compasses weren't working, that both compasses were spinning out of control and he couldn't determine which way was west. This was strange. Veteran pilots like Taylor knew that even if compasses failed, they could use the sun to orient themselves. It was mid-afternoon. The sun was clearly visible to the southwest. But Taylor seemed completely disoriented, as if he were in a different world where the basic rules of navigation didn't apply. Minutes passed and the situation worsened. Taylor reported seeing what appeared to be the Florida Keys below them, but that was impossible. If they were really over the Keys, they would be flying over shallow, green waters, not over the deep blue ocean they were describing. Communications between the Flight 19 pilots were also picked up by the control towers. Confusion could be heard, even panic. One pilot suggested they fly west until they found land, but Taylor rejected this, convinced that if they flew west they would end up in the Gulf of Mexico. At 4:45, 1 hour after the first emergency report, Taylor made a decision that would seal Flight 19's fate. He ordered all aircraft to fly northeast, believing this would take them back to Florida. But if they were really where the evidence suggests they were, over the Bahamas, flying northeast was taking them further and further away from any possibility of salvation. Fuel was running out. The TBM Avengers had autonomy for about 4 hours of flight, and they had already been in the air for more than 2 hours. Control towers desperately tried to guide the lost pilots, but Taylor had stopped following instructions. He seemed to be in his own world, making decisions that made no sense to anyone else. At 5:50 in the afternoon, as the sun began to set, a chilling transmission was heard. Taylor passed flight leadership to another pilot, Marine Lieutenant George Stivers, admitting he was completely lost. But Stivers was also disoriented, and the formation continued flying northeast, moving further and further away from any hope of rescue. Weather conditions were also deteriorating rapidly. A storm was approaching from the north, with strong winds and reduced visibility. Controllers could hear in the radio transmissions how the wind was beginning to batter the aircraft, and the pilots' voices became more tense with each passing minute. At 6:20, fuel was practically exhausted. The pilots reported that their tanks were almost empty. At that moment, Taylor made the final decision. When the first plane ran out of fuel, the entire formation would descend together into the ocean. It was a desperate attempt to stay together until the end. The last clear transmission from Flight 19 was received at 7:04 in the evening. It was barely a whisper through the static. FT, FT, and then silence. The 14 men of Flight 19 had disappeared into the vastness of the Atlantic, but their story was far from over. A massive search operation was immediately organized. Dozens of aircraft, Navy ships, and Coast Guard vessels went out to comb the ocean. Among them, a PBM Mariner seaplane with 13 crew members aboard, commanded by Lieutenant Walter Jeffrey. Their mission was simple: find any trace of Flight 19. The Mariner took off from Banana River Naval Air Base at 7:27 in the evening, just 23 minutes after Flight 19's last transmission. It was a robust aircraft, designed specifically for search and rescue missions over the ocean. Its crew was experienced, and they carried survival equipment for any emergency. But at 7:50 in the evening, just 23 minutes after takeoff, something impossible happened. The Mariner seaplane simply disappeared from radar. There was no distress call, no emergency message, no explanation. One moment it was flying toward the search area, the next it had completely vanished. A merchant ship in the area reported seeing an explosion in the sky at approximately the same time and in the same area where the Mariner had disappeared. But when rescue teams arrived at the area, they found no debris, no oil slicks, absolutely nothing. It was as if the plane and its 13 crew members had vanished into thin air. The search continued for days. More than 300 aircraft and ships participated in what became one of the largest search operations in aviation history. They combed 380,000 square miles of ocean, from Florida to the Bahamas, from Bermuda to the North Carolina coast. They found debris from other aircraft that had crashed years before. They found empty life rafts. They found pieces of metal that didn't belong to any known aircraft. But from Flight 19 and the rescue Mariner they didn't find a single piece, not an oil stain, not a life jacket. 27 men had disappeared without leaving the slightest trace. Official investigations began immediately. The U.S. Navy formed an investigation board that interrogated all air traffic controllers, analyzed every radio transmission, and studied the meteorological conditions of that day. What they found raised more questions than it answered. Experts determined that Flight 19 had probably flown northeast until running out of fuel over the deep Atlantic, about 200 miles off the Florida coast. But this didn't explain why Taylor, an experienced pilot, had made such irrational decisions, or why his compasses had failed simultaneously. Theories began to multiply. Some aviation experts suggested that Taylor had suffered some kind of severe spatial disorientation, a condition where pilots completely lose their sense of direction. Others pointed to possible magnetic interference in the area, known to affect navigation instruments. But none of these explanations could account for all the strange aspects of the case. Why did all the compasses fail at the same time? Why did Taylor seem convinced he was in a completely different place? And how to explain the simultaneous disappearance of the rescue aircraft? The Flight 19 case became the first famous mystery associated with what would later be known as the Bermuda Triangle. During the following decades, writers and researchers would use this story as evidence of supernatural phenomena in that region of the Atlantic. Some proposed that Flight 19 had been the victim of an unknown magnetic anomaly. Others suggested more fantastic explanations: alien abductions, dimensional portals, or supernatural forces operating in that area of the ocean. But aviation experts continued searching for more rational explanations. Decades later, new investigations have shed light on what really could have happened. Meteorological records show that there were unusual atmospheric conditions in the area that day, including strong winds and pressure changes that could have affected navigation instruments. Additionally, subsequent analysis of radio transmissions suggests that Taylor may have been suffering the effects of combat post-traumatic stress. As a war veteran, he had experienced traumatic situations in the Pacific, and the stress of leading a training mission could have triggered a psychological crisis that affected his judgment. As for the Mariner seaplane that disappeared during the search, investigators now believe it probably suffered an in-flight explosion. PBM Mariners were known to have problems with fuel vapors, and several of these aircraft had exploded in flight during those years. The explosion seen by the merchant ship was probably the end of the Mariner. But even with these more rational explanations, the Flight 19 mystery continues to fascinate researchers and the general public. It's a reminder of how dangerous flying was in 1945, when navigation depended mainly on magnetic compasses and visual calculations, without the GPS and satellite communication systems we have today. The legacy of Flight 19 goes beyond mystery. It led to important changes in naval aviation training procedures. New communication protocols were implemented, emergency navigation training was improved, and stricter procedures were established for search and rescue missions. The families of the 27 men who disappeared that day never had real closure. There were no bodies to bury, no remains to recover. Their names are engraved on war memorials, but their individual stories are often lost in the larger mystery of Flight 19. Today, almost 80 years later, the Flight 19 case remains one of the most famous aviation mysteries in history. It has inspired movies, documentaries, books, and conspiracy theories. But more importantly, it remains a reminder of the brave men who risked their lives, even in peacetime, to protect their country. The Atlantic Ocean keeps many secrets, and somewhere in its depths rest the remains of Flight 19 and its 14 crew members, along with the rescue mariner and its 13 men. Their families never knew exactly what happened in those final hours, but their sacrifice has not been forgotten. The Atlantic Ocean keeps many secrets, and somewhere in its depths rest the remains of Flight 19 and its 14 crew members, along with the rescue mariner and its 13 men. Their families never knew exactly what happened in those final hours, but their sacrifice has not been forgotten. The Flight 19 story reminds us that even in the modern era, with all our technology and knowledge, the ocean remains a mysterious and dangerous place. And that sometimes, the simplest explanations, human error, mechanical failure, adverse weather conditions, can create mysteries that endure for generations. If you like this story about Flight 19, a like, comment, or subscription to the channel would be very helpful. See you in the next video.